By the 16th century, Britain had changed almost beyond recognition from the territory seized by William the Conqueror. But it was still a place that we might find strange and stifling. Most people lived and died farming the land. A few thousand aristocrats and a king still owned most of the country's wealth. And ruling everyone's lives was that rich, hugely powerful and profoundly medieval institution, the Roman Catholic Church. But all that was about to go up in flames.
In the middle of the 16th century, the Catholic Church came crashing down, and it brought the medieval world with it. A tumultuous century of riots and rebellion followed, in which the people killed their king.
It was a time when many characteristics of the modern nation emerged. We championed the underdog and embraced political rights, secular entertainment, and capitalism. 8,000 years before, the British Isles had begun life as a backwater on the edge of Europe. Come 1700, they were at the centre of a new world. This would be the Seventh Age of Britain. The story of Britain's transformation from medieval to modern can be sought out in places like Inverary, a small town at the head of Loch Fyne in the west of Scotland. There's a small cross here. It may seem unremarkable, but it symbolises the first stage in the reshaping of Britain, the Reformation, when the country changed from Catholic to Protestant. But you have to look closely. At first glance, it's just like the many crosses that were erected when the British were pious Catholics.
But about 2/3 of the way up, there's a strange gap, a void where there was once an image of the crucifixion of Christ. After the Protestant Reformation, idolatry was banned. Religious images were considered at best a distraction and at worst blasphemous, so locals hacked out the offending part.
The Reformation hit England and Scotland in very different ways. When the Pope refused to grant Henry VIII his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, the king's radical solution was to divorce his kingdom from the Catholic Church. With the Roman Catholic Church in England abolished by the state, the new Protestant religion of Northern Europe slowly flowed into the void. In Scotland, however, the Reformation, or Great Cleansing as it was known, was sudden and dramatic, carried across the glens on the lips of charismatic speakers like John Knox. The new religion was completely different to the old. For generations, going to church meant being submerged in the intensely visual world of Catholicism. Now, saints' statues were smashed and religious paintings whitewashed. The Protestant God was not to be seen.
For the fishermen who plied these waters on the Firth of Forth, you can only imagine what it must have felt like to have to deal with this whole new spiritual landscape. For generations, they'd known that their best protection was holy water and the images of saints, but the new faith deemed all that the devil's work. Now all they had to rely on to keep them safe against the dangers of the sea were their own prayers to an invisible God.
The social consequences went far beyond theology. This is St Columba's, purpose-built in 1592 as a Protestant church in Burnt Island on the north bank of the Firth of Forth. It's completely unlike Catholic churches. They're often tunnels of hierarchy, with the priest at one end, separated from his congregation. In contrast, St Columba's is square. Everybody's the same distance from the pulpit, reflecting the revolutionary idea that, to God at least, social status meant nothing.
Communion was celebrated here in the middle And it was not the priest officiating in the same way as it had been in the medieval church. It is the congregation at communion sitting around ordinary trestle tables and benches. And the whole idea was that you were sitting around in a meal and everybody is of equal status.
It's not that social status was abolished. Far from it. Within the church, rich guild members like fishermen had special galleries, and the laird and his family had a grand pew of their own. The difference now was that though status got you a nice place to sit, it no longer protected you from God's wrath.
There's a very interesting example of Alison Ramsay, who is a servant girl in a laird's household, who becomes pregnant, and she declares that the father is in fact the laird's son, William Orrock. William denies the whole thing totally.
What happened next would never have happened in the old Catholic order. The laird's son could no longer assume his feudal power would protect him. He could no longer talk to a priest in the privacy of a confession booth and then buy absolution. He had to sit in the middle of the kirk, facing the entire congregation, and explain his actions.
They ask for details. Where did this happen, they say. Alison says, in the bakehouse where she normally slept. And at the same time, William has to come up and, in the presence of God, as they say, and his congregation, has to deny it on oath, so that both the man and the woman are treated equally, though they are very different social status. And in this case, the session cannot prove that William is the father, so they cannot put him on the penitent stool, but they make very sure that the community knows the details of the case.
You can imagine the impact on the congregation of seeing the laird's son cross-examined, just like a servant girl. The poorer in society began to sense they had rights. At the same time, thanks to relatively few epidemics and sharper agricultural methods, the population doubled to around 4 million. It was an explosive combination. Ironically, those agricultural improvements made farming less labour-intensive, and many thousands migrated to the country's expanding cities in search of jobs. And this is where most came, a city on the brink of greatness, London. Its population in 1600 had reached 200,000. Many ended up in large shanty towns outside the walls of the medieval city. Just north of St Paul's is Turnmill Street. In 1600, it was a lawless hotbed of petty criminals, beggars and vagrants. It was also one of the most notorious red light areas in Europe.
Dotted along here were tenement buildings, some of them 4 stories high, with a prostitute in every room. Of course, a lot of what went on here was grim and abusive. But if you read between the lines of contemporary accounts, you also get a sense of a world that was crackling with a dangerous energy. At least those unwanted vagrants had a chance of making a life for themselves here. And a number of the fresh-faced girls who started out as prostitutes ended up owning brothels and running taverns. The authorities hated all of this because it was anarchic and threatening. But for the people who lived and worked here, there must have been moments when they enjoyed the knowledge that they were part of a burgeoning counterculture.
London was seething with new ideas. One way these were expressed came from the large population's need to be entertained. In medieval England, most live entertainment had come in the form of mystery plays, biblical stories acted out during religious festivals. Elizabeth I's Protestant government banned the mystery plays. Savvy impresarios like brothel owner Philip Henslow spotted a gap in the market, and and invented what we now call show business. In Elizabethan England, for the first time, secular topics, marriage and adultery, politics and history, were turned into popular theatre. Demand was phenomenal, and people flocked to the country's first purpose-built theatres. These are the foundations of the Rose, built in 1587. In the decade that followed, a new play was being written in London every day. Actors were expected to learn around 5,000 words a week. The audiences, rich and poor alike, loved it.
Standing pressed up against the stage were the groundlings, men and women who paid a penny apiece to be here. Threepence could have bought you a seat with a cushion, and if you could afford sixpence, that's around about £30 in today's rate, then you had the option of a place in one of the galleries that would have ranked up above me. Mind you, no amount of money could have spared you from the acrid stench of this place. Visitors complained of the fug of smoke from that new fad tobacco and of stinkards, neighbours who reeked of garlic and urine. Clearly, though, it was all worth enduring, because here you could experience some of the greatest plays written in the English language.
Scourge the bad revolting stars that have consented unto Henry's death. King Henry V, too famous to live long, England ne'er lost a king of so much worth.
These lines come from what was probably Shakespeare's first play, Henry VI, Part 1, performed at the Rose in March 1592. Shakespeare didn't choose English history as a subject out of personal interest. He knew it was the hot topic that put bums on seats.
Because of the break from Rome, the English nation is trying to establish itself as an independent nation with a kind of identity of its own, really for the first time. And so the telling of national history, the heroic stories of Henry V conquering France, or the story of bad King John, these were a very important means by which writers and acting companies took part in a process of sort of developing a sense of national identity. So there's lots of different things going on at once. It's simultaneously popular entertainment, but also nation building.
The great playwrights went further. It wasn't enough to ask what it meant to be English. They asked what it meant to be human.
One of the things that they saw was the actor playing the part of a character, standing alone on the stage, thinking about themselves. That thing called the soliloquy, which really gets invented in the plays here at the Rose and is then developed in the most extraordinary way by Shakespeare. And I think that really did have an extraordinarily profound effect on the English psyche. The idea of the supremacy of the individual, the thinking self, in a way that liberates you to start questioning the hierarchies and institutions of society. And I don't think it's too far-fetched to claim that some of the seeds that led to the extraordinary transformation of 50 years later, when the English decided to execute their king, that the foundations for those were maybe laid here at the Rose.
In Queen Elizabeth's England, ordinary people were savouring the chance to do two very dangerous things: think for themselves and question authority. It could lead to only one thing: revolution.
In pulpits and theatres, in pamphlets and plays, an increasingly literate population was thinking for itself. At the same time, a king, Charles I, who believed in his absolute divine right to rule, came to the throne. The scene was set for a series of showdowns.
One of these took place here in Malden in Essex in 1629. In that year there was a severe shortage of food, but one which had as much to do with the behaviour of the new merchants as with the poor harvest. With King Charles I's permission, entrepreneurs were buying up grain and exporting it across the channel.
The poor faced famine, and to see grain being taken abroad to feed their enemies was extremely shocking. For others, those who were profiting from the development of a capitalist economy, this was something to be expected. 1629 put those two groups into conflict.
There was a new Bolshevik English spirit at work. When Flemish ships arrived to take away the corn, a group of rowdy Essex girls led a vociferous protest.
We know that on Sunday the sailors down here were talking and grumbling about the presence of these foreign merchants. A group of women heard them, and on Monday they called to each other. They walk through the town calling to each other, and they assemble a crowd. They drag their children behind them, they brush aside the authorities who are trying to stop them, and they march to the boats. There they form themselves into a boarding party, and they force the Flemish sailors. You can imagine these Flemish sailors' shock. 150 women confronting them. They force these sailors to put the grain into their aprons. Fabulous image of these women standing there with their demanding that their grain be given back to them. And having done that, they then march back to town.
It wasn't just some kind of proto-feminism that meant women led the revolt. A loophole in the law meant they were exempt from punishment.
It was believed that women who committed an offence without a man of discretion, the contemporary phrase, moving them to commit it, were not guilty of a crime. And in riot after riot, you find women defiantly saying to their victims, "We are only women, and we are without the law." And I think in 1629, that idea runs deep through the women's ability to go and take the grain.
When the authorities tried to pin the riot on men acting behind the scenes, one of the women ringleaders took full responsibility. It wasn't men that made them riot, she said. It was
the cry of the country and my own want.
These types of crowd involvements reflect, I think, an England in which the people had a sense of their rights and weren't afraid to take action to establish what their rights were.
The problem was, how do you demand political rights in a society where there's no press and where it's just the landowners? That's a tiny percentage of the population have the right to vote. For the majority, there was only one obvious option: violence. And from the end of the 16th century through to the 1640s, there were riots throughout the country. Some were over food prices, some were over land rights, some over religious niceties. These were grievances that had been simmering for centuries and had now reached boiling point.
the story of this turmoil and how it touched the lives of ordinary people is vividly recorded in the Derbyshire Peak District. The writings survive of a community of miners who lived and worked here, scratching out a living in back-breaking shafts that burrow through unyielding rock.
Hundreds upon hundreds of men came here, and this is what they risked their lives for. Unrefined lead that they then sold on to the highest bidder. It was a grimy, macho world with every man for himself.
These pick marks are a grim testimony to a hard, brutal life, where men hacked nuggets of lead oxide out of the rock with nothing more than muscle power. Not surprisingly, these miners had grown increasingly angry over taxes levied on their lead. In the past, their protests had fallen on deaf ears.
And then in 1642, the high politics of church and state hit the rock face. Suddenly, the miners who sweated down here found themselves caught up in a revolution.
The English Civil War had begun, and it would prove an extraordinary opportunity for people like the Derbyshire lead miners to be heard. During the 1630s, King Charles reformed the Church of England. Many MPs in the House of Commons, enthusiastic Protestants, thought it was a plot to return the country to Catholicism, and were horrified. In 1642, the unthinkable happened. King and Parliament went to war. The Civil War began over religion, but its effects went far beyond that. Both King and Parliament had to persuade people to join their cause, and for the first time this availed the population of an opportunity to negotiate privileges and rights from their aristocratic superiors in a way that would have been unthinkable in medieval England. The Derbyshire miners suddenly found they had real clout. Their lead was now of great strategic importance.
It's a critical military resource. Lead is used for the manufacture of shot, and therefore both the King and the Parliament's forces during the period of the English Civil Wars after 1642 are keen to control lead-producing areas such as here in Derbyshire.
A focal point for these lead mining communities were pubs, like the Old Miners' Arms at Eyam, which dates from this time. It was in places like this that you could have met the tough, politically savvy customers the King and Parliament had to try to persuade to join them.
The collapse of the English state in 1642 forces people to engage with politics in new ways, because they're seeing armies marching through their village, they're seeing their young men conscripted, they're forced to pay increasing taxation to both sides of the military conflict. People are forced to have opinions on these issues, to argue the toss as to which side had the better political claims, whether it was the King or the Parliament. So the 17th century alehouse was a profoundly politicised environment.
In medieval England, it was the King's feudal right that people fight for him. There were no negotiations involved. Now, Charles I was reduced to writing a grovelling letter to a bunch of stroppy miners.
Our gracious and princely intention is to maintain and to enlarge unto our loyal and good subjects the miners in our county of Derby, that they shall serve us, and not depart from us in this our present expedition.
And you can imagine them opening up the King's Declaration, reading it aloud, others listening and arguing the toss. Well, should we listen to him? Is he our liege lord, or is he just a griping Norman tyrant? What attitude should we have to the King? Are his demands reasonable? Significantly, the miners reply with their own printed declaration in which they negotiate with him.
May it please your most gracious majesty, that the greatest grievance we have long undergone is paying tithes and duties not due by law. From this oppression, we most humbly desire to be freed.
They ask him to eliminate certain taxes, certain dues, which the Crown has traditionally levied upon the mining population. And in return for the abolition of those dues, they say that they will support him in his military campaign against the Parliament. And then the King replies back to them and says, that's fine, I'm prepared to do as you request. So there's actually a negotiation, a complicated negotiation being conducted between these assertive, rebellious miners and the King of England.
War changes society in surprising ways. Neither the King nor the landowning classes that led Parliament wanted to give the lower orders more rights, but they found themselves forced to. Oliver Cromwell based his military success against the King on the simple realisation that to win battles, you need to promote men with ability and commitment, and not automatically prefer someone with aristocratic connections.
I'd rather have a russet-coated captain who knows what he fights for than what you call a gentleman and is nothing else.
And when Cromwell's russet-coated captains routed the King's army, it unleashed a sense throughout the country that the traditional privileges of the aristocracy were meaningless. In the Derby Peak District, the same miners who'd negotiated with the King took on their old feudal lord, the Earl of Rutland. They moved onto his land near his seat at Haddon Hall. They rounded up and ate his deer, and gouged great craters in his beautiful parkland to get at the rich lead seams underneath. Not surprisingly, the Earl was furious.
For the next 2 years, there are a running series of fights involving hundreds of men on both sides, armed miners turning up on the very field on which we're standing and engaging in protracted fisticuffs with the Earl of Rutland's son, with his retainers. The gentry of Derbyshire ride out from Haddon Hall, tooled up with swords and pistols and armour, try to ride the miners down, sometimes chase them off, sometimes throw them over the corner of cliffs. The miners return, having gathered in some of the local churches in their hundreds, and batter the local gentry. So, quite literally, this is a field of conflict. It's a field of legal conflict, but it's also a field of physical conflict. And the precise issue concerns the question of who has entitlement to the mineral reserves of this particular field. But the bigger issue involves the question of who rules England in the 1640s. Is it to be the common people, or is it to be the nobility and gentry?
The world had been turned upside down. This radicalism reached its logical conclusion in January 1649. Bowing to pressure from political hotheads in its own army, Parliament tried and condemned King Charles I for treason against his own people. He was found guilty of using
tyrannical power to rule according to his will and to overthrow the rights and liberties of the people of England.
It was an extraordinary decision, given no one had actually defined these rights and liberties. Nonetheless, on the 30th of January, soldiers led the king onto a scaffold built outside his own palace in Whitehall. There, he was executed with a single blow of an axe. The huge crowd couldn't believe its eyes. A contemporary account describes,
"Such a groan by the thousands then present, as I never heard before, and I desire I may never hear again."
After the execution, Parliament issued an unapologetic statement.
The office of the king in this nation is unnecessary.
In just under a decade, the country had gone from the rule of kings by divine right to no one quite knew what. In the next few years, a whole variety of political systems would be tried out. Fundamentalist religious rule, government by Parliament, even the dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell. And then in 1660, an exhausted nation restored Charles I's son to the throne. You'd imagine that after decades of turmoil and mayhem, the country would be in tatters. But for some, this was the beginning of a golden age. The population was sick and tired of war and upheaval. From now on, they'd leave political theorising and its bloody consequences to the French and concentrate on the irresistible business of making money.
In the century between the Reformation in the 1540s and the Civil War in the 1640s, while the British were fighting for political rights, there was a parallel story of a nation becoming a commercial superpower. During this time, ever more ships reached the Americas and India. Trade boomed. The buying and selling of sugar, tobacco, silks and spices created a class of new men, financiers, merchants and entrepreneurs, who owed their power not to aristocratic blood, but to business nous. This growing overseas trade coincided with a massive redistribution of land. Between 1540 and 1640, the number of landowners would treble as the feudal gentry sold their estates to the new merchant class. The process was given a massive boost when King Henry VIII closed down the monasteries and sold off their vast holdings to eager entrepreneurs.
The fate of the abbey here at Malmesbury in Gloucestershire was typical. For nearly 850 years, it had been a Benedictine monastery. And then, in December 1539, it was seized in the name of the king and sold on, in this case to a certain William Stump. Stump was a recent convert to the Protestant faith and one of a new breed of entrepreneurs who saw the dissolution of the monasteries as the most fantastic business opportunity.
Stump filled the abbey buildings with looms and supplied wool to markets all over Europe.
The irony is that back in the 14th century, the monks here had run a successful wool production business. But whereas they were working to enrich the Catholic Church, Stump's motive was to become a player in the first ever global economy.
Stump paid £1,516, 15 shillings and 2.5 pence for this historic monastery. And he was obviously a pretty astute businessman, because he soon made enough money to build this grand house with its fine gardens. The switch in the function of these abbey buildings marks the glide from medieval to modern. Monks, shrouded in incense, enacting mysterious rituals, were gone. Businessmen like Stump no longer put their faith in imagery, but in commerce. Catholic magic was giving way to Protestant pragmatism.
Between roughly 1500 and roughly 1700, there's really a big change in how people think about the world in England. And folk who get up on their hind legs and claim that they've given birth to rabbits, or they've seen a dragon in the sky, or they've cut down an oak tree and found a portrait of King Charles I inside, magically put there, begin to be treated as loonies. Part of the reason for that change is the increasing quantification, enumeration of people's lives.
During this century, as accounting, land measurement, interest rates and calculations became part of everyday life, success depended on becoming numerate.
You look in a mid-17th century yeoman farmer's account book, what you see is a lot of increasingly rational calculation. How much did I spend on feeding the cows? What's going to be the price at market? How much did I spend on that ploughman who then bunked off after only 2 days' work? The growth in that rational accounting mentality is really marked in 17th century England.
And with calculation came a scientific and technological revolution. Nature, once seen as subject to God's whims, was now shown to obey precise mathematical rules, laid out in Isaac Newton's masterpiece of 1687, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. A fresh breed of scientifically curious intellectuals began to lead the nation in a new direction. They met at a club called the Royal Society, founded in 1660. Men like architect Christopher Wren and physicist surveyor Robert Hooke got a spectacular opportunity to demonstrate their vision when disaster struck the capital. In 1666, the Great Fire of London destroyed the heart of the medieval city. To replace it, a modern city with wide streets, magnificent churches and buildings of brick and stone was planned. This dream, though only partly realised in London, set the tone for the nation. The fires that were common in medieval tinderbox towns were seen by some as a timely opportunity, as in Warwick in 1694.
We're very close to the spot here where a man was walking across the road with a lighted brand of wood, probably carrying it into his house to light his own hearth. Apparently a spark flew up from the lighted brand and hit one of the thatch roofs up there. Now, there was a huge wind blowing up from Stratford. What happened was that the thatch roof caught fire. Suddenly, the whole of the street lit up. It seems that the wind actually picked up pieces of burning thatch and threw them across the town. These soon coalesced into one grand fire. 4 or 5 hours later, when the fire finally started to die out, something in the order of 150 or so properties had been destroyed.
The fire was on a much smaller scale than London's, but it presented the people of Warwick with a clean slate on which to draw their brave new world. The old medieval wooden wattle town, with its crowded streets and stinking, tumultuous markets, was replaced by pristine stone and brick buildings. Some of the more traditional, scruffier businesses like smithies were relegated to the outside of the town, creating space for fashionable trades like clockmaking. Attracted by these new civilised businesses, many moved in to enjoy the burgeoning recreational facilities and indulge the new craze for shopping.
The shopping revolution is really about the growing number of goods that are being produced, which are of a luxury or semi-luxury character, which are not basic necessities to people. And we're actually standing here in the point which really was a fashionable shopping centre of Warwick. For example, Robert Blissett would have been selling fine cloths, and then across from me, a huge variety of products, including things like expensive spices. We had a cutler, we had a saddler, a bookseller, a very exciting new occupation in the town.
Towns were rapidly becoming the desirable place to be. And by the end of the 17th century, the proportion of those working on the land had dropped from 90% to just 40%. Nowhere was the shift from a rural to an urban way of life more apparent than in London.
I think this growth of London reverberated throughout Britain, generating all sorts of urban expectations. And you might then ask me, why was London growing? I think the growth of London probably is based upon the changing global position of Britain. Whereas at the beginning of the 16th century, it's right on the edge of Europe. By the end of the 17th century, with the growth of the Atlantic economy, it now becomes at the centre of a burgeoning global economy.
The symbolic moment when the government realised how crucial trade was to the nation was when they decided to remedy the parlous state of British money. The currency was constantly being devalued because counterfeiters snipped bits of the edges off coins and melted these down to make new ones. Britain was the first country to fix this problem. In a massive undertaking, the government called in all the coins in circulation and replaced them with new ones, which, like ours today, had milled edges to foil the counterfeiters.
The Great Recoinage, as it was known, was considered so important, it was entrusted to the greatest brain in the country, Isaac Newton. He took his job very seriously and supervised the design of the minting machines, as well as making sure that anyone who was caught counterfeiting ended up on the gallows. The inscription he chose to decorate his new trustworthy coins reads Decus et tutamen, an ornament and a safeguard.
This motto is still inscribed on pound coins today.
And that project of recoining goes along with an entire financial revolution, the establishment of the National Bank, the Bank of England, the establishment of that splendid English institution, the national debt, and the growth in power of the exchange and of the stock market. All these things go together. An attempt really to ground the authority of everyday exchange in the financial markets of London. And by 1700, really, that's happened.
In late 17th century Britain, many, particularly the better off, were sipping coffee, speculating in shares, going to the theatre, and living in a world ruled predominantly by reason rather than just magic. But not everyone would embrace the future so readily. By 1700, two of the great changes of the previous 150 years, the Protestant Reformation and commercial opportunity, were combining to create modern Britain. Nowhere was this more apparent than in people's changing attitudes to time. For a start, clocks had become cheaper, so more people could own them. The importance of business and commerce had also changed the pace of life. Appointments had to be kept. Goods had to be delivered on time. And in addition, Protestants placed a far greater emphasis than Catholics on punctuality. The key Catholic festivals were relaxed, day-long affairs, scheduled around the rhythms of the agricultural year. In contrast, Protestants wanted you in church on time to hear the sermon from the beginning right to the end.
When God's presence is taken away, there is nothing but horror and trembling and I.
After the Reformation, clocks like these weren't simply devices to mark time, but were a way of evaluating how wisely that time was being spent. The righteous used their time productively, whereas frittering away time was seen as a mark of the undeserving, idle poor.
The godly family is the family that does what is appropriate at each time of the day and night, that doesn't waste time, that spends it appropriately, and that marks the hours and weeks in a rational, orderly, and pious way. And this is always contrasted with the wastefulness, with the dissolute, with the uncaring part of society. So it's seen that the poor are poor because they haven't spent time properly.
In 1697, a law was passed demanding that paupers wear badges to mark them out. The Protestant work ethic had arrived, and with God demanding that every second marked by the ticking clock be used productively, the age of progress had begun. And it wouldn't just be the poor who lost out.
The aristocracy, too, was being given a run for their money by a new breed of entrepreneurs. These were Britain's fledgling capitalists, and love them or hate them, they would change the way that we lived and worked forever.
This is Neath in Wales. In 1700, this was the site of a coal mining complex, run by a budding capitalist, Humphrey Mackworth. With Bible in one hand and clock in the other, he wanted a return on the investment he'd made here, buying the land and installing mining equipment. He had to change the way his miners worked.
Previously, people would be paid piece rates. Mow that area of land for such and such an amount of money, thresh that quarter of grain, I'll pay you so much. This is now, and people could do it very much in their own time. Now what is driving the investor, the entrepreneur, is to get a regular workforce turning up daily at set times.
Mackworth wanted his employees to work 6 days a week for a salary, and to turn up to work on time. The miners weren't interested. But unlike the cliched exploiter, Mackworth responded with carrots rather than sticks. He offered his men sick pay, pensions, and greatly increased salaries. Protestant capitalists like Mackworth were sowing the seeds of our way of working. What drove them was a belief that making money had a higher moral purpose. A friend of Mackworth's wrote,
"The poor miners and labourers should have some small share with you in so rich a treasure. They have spent their lives to make you rich, and they should have a comfortable subsistence provided for them. This will bring you a blessing from heaven.
Demand for coal was so high that Mackworth's mines were highly profitable, even if the policy of offering high wages could backfire spectacularly.
Often high wages lead to these workers taking more time off. So you get a vicious circle. The more you pay them, the less they're willing to work, because they satisfy their basic needs of consumption, their food, and look after their families. And beyond that, they think, well, do I want to go to work today, or shall I take a day off? So you see them expanding their purchases. They're buying ribbons, buckles, mirrors, furniture for their houses, but they're not fully converted. And the reason for this is that the goods they're buying are still rather expensive.
It would take 100 years or more for workers to be persuaded that full-time employment was worthwhile. And for that to happen, somehow, more goods had to be made more quickly and more cheaply. And the country that got there first would lead the world into the modern age.
Since Britain had become an island back in the Stone Age, it had been the muscle of man and beast, with a little bit of help from running water and strong winds, that had powered the country. Then, 8,000 years later, in a corner of the West Midlands near Dudley, one man realised a dream that would change all that forever.
This contraption, built by an ironmonger called Thomas Newcomen in 1712, was the first time heat and steam were harnessed usefully. It pumped water at 120 gallons a minute out of coal mines. As the Seventh Age of Britain came to a close, God, it seemed, had found a new purpose for her people: to go forth and prosper. We began our history of the British people in the Stone Age. We've tracked the ebb and flow of ideas that have shaped our nation. We became farmers, forged communities, assimilated invaders and immigrants, learnt the power of the written word, embraced Christianity, endured terrible hardships, fought for political rights, and finally gave the world the modern industrial society.
And the book of the series, 7 Ages of Britain, is available in the shops now, priced at £20. To order a copy, call 0870 1234 344 or click on to channel4.com/shop. Now, next on 4, Bruce Willis faces an evil like never before in the sci-fi comedy The Fifth Element.